Hmm. If you want to skip ahead, drop a comment below and tell me, has anyone in your family ever made a decision about your life while you weren't able to stop them? I want to hear your stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that button now, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing that changes how you think about trust forever. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, raised one son mostly on my own after my wife Carol passed from ovarian cancer when our boy was 14, and I built, with my own two hands and every dollar I could scrape together, a 4-acre property outside of Clarksburg, West Virginia, that I called home for the last 22 years. A house, a workshop, a small barn, and enough land that I could breathe. I want you to remember that workshop. It matters later. On the morning of March the 4th, I woke up and couldn't feel the left side of my face. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and watched my reflection like it belonged to someone else. My left hand wasn't responding the way it should. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, told myself it was nothing, told myself I'd had a long week, and then I slid off the edge of that bathtub and onto the tile floor, and I didn't get up on my own. I had suffered a moderate ischemic stroke. I was 62 years old, in reasonable health, did not smoke, walked 2 miles every morning, and I had a stroke on a Tuesday in my bathroom while the coffee was still brewing downstairs. Life does not ask for your permission. I was taken to Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown. The first 3 days I was largely unresponsive, and for about 11 days after that I was conscious but confused, unable to speak clearly, unable to walk without assistance, and deeply dependent on the people around me. I had some cognitive fog that the doctors said was normal and temporary. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Not the stroke itself, which I don't remember, but waking up inside a body that wasn't cooperating, in a room full of machines, being told to squeeze a nurse's hand, and not being entirely sure I understood the instruction. My son, Derek, was there. He flew in from Phoenix, where he'd been living for 4 years with his wife Tamsin. I was glad to see him. I want you to understand that, because nothing that comes after should make you think otherwise. When he walked into that hospital room on day 2 and held my hand, I cried. I hadn't cried in front of my son since Carol's funeral. I cried, and he told me I was going to be fine, and I believed him. What I did not know, what I could not have known, lying in that hospital bed with a brain that was still rebooting, was that Derek and Tamsin had already started making plans. Not plans to help me recover, plans for the property. They had arrived in Clarksburg 2 days after my stroke. They had my spare key, which I'd given Derek years ago for emergencies, and somewhere in a file cabinet in my office, the same file cabinet where I kept my tax returns and Carol's old letters, and a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving since 2009. Derek found the general power of attorney I had signed in 2018, when I'd had a minor cardiac event and my doctor had recommended I put things in order just in case. That cardiac event passed. I recovered completely. The POA, which I'd never revoked because I genuinely forgot it existed, was still sitting in that file cabinet like a loaded gun nobody remembered leaving on the table. I need to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you are going to have questions about this. And rightly so. A general power of attorney, unlike a durable POA, typically becomes ineffective if the principal becomes incapacitated. Mine was not durable. It had also been signed 4 years prior to a separate medical incident and had never been formally used. Whether it was legally valid to use in this situation was, and I want to be precise here, deeply questionable. The attorney I later hired used the word fraudulent with a calmness that suggested he had seen this before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For the first week and a half of my hospital stay, Derek and Tamsin were driving back and forth between Morgantown and Clarksburg. They told the nurses they needed to manage the property. They told my neighbor Hattie, who brought me soup every Thursday and had known me for 16 years, that they were handling my affairs. Hattie thought they meant mail and bills. She told me this later, in a voice that made clear she wished she'd asked more questions. On day 9 of my hospitalization, Derek used that power of attorney, in consultation with a local real estate agent I had never met, to list my property. On day 14, he accepted an offer. The buyers were Tamsin's parents, Gerald and Marlene Forsyth, who had relocated from Scottsdale to Clarksburg specifically, I would later learn, at Derek and Tamsin's invitation. The sale price was $220,000 for a property that had been independently valued at $340,000 8 months prior. I had no mortgage. I owned it outright. The closing happened on day 18 of my hospitalization. I was in a physical therapy session relearning how to button a shirt. I came home from the hospital on day 26. Derek picked me up, drove me to what I believed was still my property, and walked me through the front door. The house had been rearranged. There were throw pillows I didn't recognize on my couch. The small framed photo of Carol and me at Seneca Rocks, the one I kept on the mantel for 19 years, was sitting on the kitchen counter. Not displayed. Just placed there, like something waiting to be boxed up. Gerald and Marlene were sitting at my kitchen table. I want to take a moment to describe the sensation of walking into your own home and feeling like a guest. It is not dramatic, the way it sounds when you read it. It's quiet. It's the absence of something you didn't know you were always feeling. The specific weight of belonging somewhere. I had built 2 of those bookshelves myself. I had chosen the color of those walls. I had planted the oak tree visible through the back window 20 years ago with a shovel and a bag of mulch, and very little idea what I was doing. Gerald stood up and extended his hand. "Walter," he said, "we're so glad you're doing better. We've been looking after the place." Derek was standing slightly behind me near the door. I turned to look at him. My speech was still a little slow at that point, a remnant of the stroke that would improve over the following months. And I think he may have counted on that. I think he may have believed that the cognitive fog, the fatigue, the general disorientation of a man who had just spent nearly 4 weeks in a hospital would give them enough of a buffer. What Derek had perhaps forgotten was that I had been a structural engineer for 31 years. My entire career was built on the principle that the thing most likely to fail is the thing everyone assumed was fine. "What is this?" I said. Not a question, a statement. Tamsin came in from the hallway. She had the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed a difficult conversation and is now discovering that the script doesn't quite fit the room. "Dad," she said. And I want to note that she called me Dad, which she had done for 4 years and which I had genuinely appreciated. "We want to talk to you about something, about the future, about what makes sense." What made sense, as she explained it over the next 40 minutes while Gerald and Marlene sat at my kitchen table nodding slowly like a pair of metronomes, was this: I had nearly died. I was 62 years old. The property was a lot for one person to manage. Derek and Tamsin loved me and wanted to make sure I was cared for. They had found a beautiful assisted living community in Morgantown. Not a nursing home, Dad. It's really more like a resort, where I could have my own room and access to medical care and social activities. The property, meanwhile, had been transferred. While I was relearning how to button a shirt, there was a silence in that kitchen that I think all 5 of us understood differently. Derek looked at the floor. Marlene examined her hands. Gerald cleared his throat. Tamsin waited. I asked to see the paperwork. Derek said he'd get it to me. Not that he had it, that he'd get it to me. I noticed that. I told them I was tired, which was true. I was exhausted, and that I needed to rest. They showed me to the guest room of my own house, the room where I used to store my fishing equipment and the box of Derek's childhood drawings I'd kept since 1994. The fishing rods were gone. The drawings were gone. There was a bed with a beige comforter that I had never seen before in my life. I lay down on that bed and I stared at the ceiling for a long time. And I thought about a man named Raymond Kowalski. Raymond Kowalski was my father's oldest friend. He had died in 2019, and in his will, which I had not thought about in years, which I had honestly almost forgotten entirely, he had left me a 40% stake in a small equipment leasing company based out of Fairmont, roughly 30 miles away. Not the company itself. A stake. Passive income, essentially. The other 60% was held by Raymond's nephew, a quiet and reliable man named Gus, who ran the operation and sent me a quarterly check that I deposited without much ceremony. The company was called Kowalski Lift and Equipment. It was not glamorous. It leased forklifts and industrial lifts to construction sites and warehouses across north-central West Virginia. It made money in the way that unglamorous businesses often do, steadily, quietly, without anyone paying it much attention. It was not listed anywhere in my personal financial documents. It was held through a small LLC that Raymond had set up before his death, and my ownership stake was documented in estate paperwork that lived in a storage unit I rented in Fairmont, not in the file cabinet in my office in Clarksburg. Derek did not know it existed. Tamsin did not know it existed. Gerald and Marlene Forsyth, sitting at what they believed was their kitchen table, did not know it existed. I called Gus the next morning from the guest room of my own house, using the cell phone Derek had helpfully returned to me at the hospital along with my wallet and my watch. Gus answered on the second ring. "Walter," he said, "I heard you were in the hospital." "I'm sorry, brother. How are you doing?" I told him I was doing better than expected. Then I asked him a question I had never asked before in 4 years of quarterly checks. I asked him what the stake was worth. There was a brief pause. "Well," Gus said carefully, "we had a pretty strong year. The valuation right now, conservatively, I'd put it around $380,000. Could be a bit more if the Clarksburg expansion goes through." I thanked him. I told him I'd be in touch soon. I hung up, put the phone on the beige comforter, and sat with that number for a while. Then I called my attorney. His name is David Mercer. He is 60 years old, has an office above a dry cleaner on Pike Street in Morgantown, drives a 10-year-old Subaru, and is the sharpest legal mind I've encountered in 6 decades of living. I told David everything. The stroke, the POA, the sale, the price, the forces at the kitchen table. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the particular tone of a man who has been practicing law for 35 years and has seen this precise scenario before, "Walter, the general POA you signed in 2018 almost certainly did not grant authority to execute a real estate transaction of this nature, and even if it did, the sale price represents a potential breach of fiduciary duty that a court would find very interesting." He said he needed to see the documents. I said I had asked for them and been told they'd be forthcoming. David said he'd send a formal request that afternoon. When Derek received David's letter, something shifted in the house. The dinners became quieter. Tamsin stopped calling me Dad. Gerald and Marlene made a point of being out of the house during the day, which I appreciated in the way that you appreciate discovering that a persistent noise has stopped. Derek came to the guest room door one evening, knocked, and came in to sit in the chair in the corner. He looked for the first time since the hospital, like my son. Not the man who had come to explain to me why my own house made more sense as someone else's house, just my son. Tired and a little frightened. "Dad," he said, "I want you to know that I was trying to look out for you." I looked at him for a long moment. The fog was mostly gone by then. My speech was nearly back to normal. I was doing the 2-mile walk every morning again, up and down the road outside because I hadn't decided yet what road was mine. "I know you believe that," I said. "That's the part that's hardest for me." He didn't say anything. "You used a document I signed when your mother had been dead 4 years and I was scared and alone," I said. "You used it while I was in a hospital bed. You sold my home, the home where I raised you, the home where I still have your mother's china in a cabinet, to your wife's parents for 60% of what it was worth. And then you put me in the guest room." Derek looked at the floor. "I want to be your father," I said. "I intend to keep being your father, but I need you to understand what you did." David filed suit the following week. The grounds were multiple, improper use of a general POA for real estate transactions outside its scope, potential elder financial abuse under West Virginia statute, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent conveyance given the sale price relative to assessed value. The filing made very clear that the estate of a man who had just suffered a stroke and was in active inpatient rehabilitation did not constitute a properly consenting principal for the purposes of a major asset sale. Gerald and Marlene hired their own attorney. He was not as sharp as David. I want to tell you something about the weeks that followed, because I think this is the part that people always want to skip to. The resolution, the reversal, the moment the music swells. And I understand that impulse, I genuinely do. But the truth of it was slower and quieter than that, and I think the quiet part matters. I moved into a short-term rental in Morgantown during the proceedings. A small apartment, 2 bedrooms, a gas stove that took some getting used to. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table and did consulting work 3 days a week. I walked every morning. I had Hattie over for dinner twice, and she brought her green bean casserole both times, bless her. Gus and I started talking more regularly. The Clarksburg expansion he'd mentioned was proceeding. He wanted my input on some of the structural assessments for the new facility. I gave it. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I still enjoyed the work. The legal process took 4 months. At the end of those 4 months, here is what happened. The sale was voided. The four sides were required to vacate and received back the $220,000 they had paid, less legal fees, which were considerable. The property was returned to my ownership. David also pursued the matter of the difference between the sale price and the assessed value as potential damages, and while that portion was ultimately settled rather than adjudicated, I will tell you that the settlement was not insignificant. Derek and Tamsin did not face criminal charges. David explained to me, with the same measured calm he applied to everything, that elder financial abuse cases rarely result in prosecution when the alleged perpetrator is a family member with a colorable claim to have been acting in the principal's interest. The bar for proving criminal intent is high, and the existence of the POA document, however improperly used, complicated things. What Derek and Tamsin did face was the practical reality of what they had done. Tamsin's parents had liquidated savings to purchase the property and then spent 4 months entangled in litigation. The relationship between Derek and his in-laws became, from what I understand, somewhat strained. Derek's employer, a mid-size engineering firm in Phoenix, apparently became aware of the situation through the public court filings, and Derek had what he described to me as some difficult conversations at work. And Derek and I had our own difficult conversations, more than one, over the phone, and eventually in person when he came back to Clarksburg in August and sat in my kitchen. My kitchen, with Carol's china back in the cabinet and the photo of us at Seneca Rocks back on the mantel. And we talked for 4 hours about his mother, and about fear, and about what it means to love someone and still do them harm. I am not going to tell you that we are fine. We are not yet fine. We are working on it, which is different, and which I think is more honest. I moved back into my property in late July. The first morning I was home, I got up before sunrise, made coffee, and walked out to the workshop. Derek and Tamsin had not touched it, I think because they weren't sure what any of it was worth or what to do with it. 400 square feet of hand tools, a lathe I'd owned for 20 years, 3 workbenches, and shelves of organized hardware that represented, if I'm being honest, the most accurate portrait of who I am that exists anywhere in the world. I ran my hand along the edge of the first workbench. I stood there in the dark for a while with my coffee, listening to the properties settling around me the way old properties do. Small sounds, familiar and specific. I thought about the word resilience, which doctors and physical therapists had used approximately 40 times during my recovery, and which I had come to find mildly irritating because it implies that the goal is simply to return to what you were before. I was not trying to return to what I was before. I was 63 years old. I had survived a stroke. I had watched my son make a decision I would not have believed him capable of, and I had come out the other side of it owning my property, a 40% stake in a growing equipment company, and a somewhat cleaner understanding of exactly where I stood and what I was made of. That is not resilience. That is something else. Something that does not have a clean name, which is fine. Not everything worth having has a clean name. I want to say one more thing before I finish, because some of you are going to ask about the assisted living facility, the resort as Tamsin called it, and I want to address that directly. I drove past it once out of curiosity. It was a nice-looking building, well-maintained, good landscaping, a patio with chairs facing a small pond. I am sure it serves its residents well, and I mean no disrespect to anyone who lives there or who made the choice to go there. I am 63 years old. I walk 2 miles every morning. I consult on structural assessments 3 days a week. Last Saturday, I built a new storage cabinet for the workshop. That is, if I say so myself, extremely solid. I am not ready for the pond. And, if the stroke taught me anything, if this whole year taught me anything, it is that the time to get your documents in order is not when you're frightened. And the person you trust to hold your affairs when you can't is the most important decision you will ever make quietly. Get a durable power of attorney if you need one. Make sure your attorney reviews it. Tell your people what you have and where it is. And maybe, just maybe, keep 1 or 2 things to yourself. If this story meant something to you, leave me a comment. Tell me your story, or tell me what you're thinking. I read everyone. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There's more to come, and I'd like you to be here for it. Take care of yourselves. I mean that.